For a few years after the sky went dark, the mornings on Earth were quieter than they had been in the whole long reign of the dinosaurs. The light would come back thin and grey the way it does through smoke. A low country of ferns ran to the horizon in every direction, waist-high, unbroken, greener than anything that would grow in that place again for a very long time. Above the height of your knee, nothing moved and no bird called. Nothing large crossed the open ground, because for the first time in over 100 million years, there was nothing large left alive to cross it. The wind moved through the fern heads. If you had been standing there, you would have heard it, the wind and your own breathing, and almost nothing else. That morning belongs to an epoch that most people have never heard named. It has no dinosaurs in it, which is why the films tend to pass it by, and no people, which is why the history books do the same. It sits in the gap, the long, quiet stretch between the age we loved as children and the one that would, in time, produce us. Geologists call it the Paleocene. The fern world of those first mornings did not last either. Ferns are the first green thing to come back to broken ground. They spread fast, they hold the soil, they cover a ruined country while everything slower recovers behind them. Give the land a few thousand years and the forests returned. Give it a few 100,000 more and those forests grew tall and strange, filled with creatures that had never walked the earth before. The whole of the Paleocene is really that one slow motion, a world all but emptied, patiently filling itself back in. The epoch ran from about 66 million years ago to about 56 million, 10 million years in all. A number like that is almost impossible to hold, so try holding it this way. The entire span of our own kind, everyone who has ever lived and every language they spoke and every fire they ever lit against the dark, would fit inside the Paleocene 30 times over, with room still left at the edges. The reason to walk into it, though, is what the world did next. Those first survivors, the small things in the litter, the burrowers and the generalists, the animals that could get by on almost nothing, were nobody's idea of a beginning. They weren't waiting to inherit the earth. They were only trying to get through the night, to find enough to eat in a broken land, and to stay small enough and quiet enough to be overlooked. That was the whole of their ambition, and for a long time it was enough. And yet, across the 10 million years that followed, they became everything. Nearly every animal you have ever loved, every warm, breathing creature that has ever slept in the same room as you, traces its line back through this epoch to those small survivors in the litter. And if you follow that thread back far enough, it ends at you. And all of it happened in a world far warmer than our own. For the whole length of the Paleocene, there were no ice caps at either pole, none at all. Palms grew far from the equator, and forests ran right down to the shores of a green and unfrozen Antarctica. If you could stand in that world and turn slowly on the spot, you would see a planet more evenly warm than any we have known since. Its heat reached almost from the equator to the poles, and even the deep oceans were warm. And slowly, across those millions of years, the sound came back. First the insects, then the small rustlings in the undergrowth, then the calls of whatever moved through the canopy overhead. The silence of that first grey morning had only ever been a pause. The earth is patient, but it does not stay empty for long. That warmth would not last forever either. 10 million years on, the epoch would end in a great heat of its own making, and close almost as suddenly as it had opened. But that ending is the far door of this story. We are only just stepping through the near one. There's something worth sitting with here before we go any further. We may be the first creatures in the whole history of the planet who can look back at a world like this one and know that it was real. The Paleocene had no witnesses. It ran in full. Every dawn, every season, every small life lived out under those fern-choked skies. And then it closed, and for 56 million years no mind held any of it. Now, somehow, we do. We carry the record of a lost world in the soft grey tissue behind our eyes. That may be the most surprising thing the Earth has ever made. Not the fire that ended the old world, and not the warm one that grew up after it, but the animal that remembers. And that, in the end, is all this really is, a slow shared act of remembering, a turning back together toward the worlds that were here long before ours. So if you find yourself drawn to these quiet descents into deep time, you might consider subscribing and staying with us for the ones still to come. And if you feel like it, tell us where you're listening from tonight, your city, and the hour where you are. It's a small thing, but a good one, to see how far these late hours reach and how many of us are awake together in the dark. Now let's begin where the epoch itself began, with something small enough to hold in the palm of one hand. A thin line of grey clay pressed into the rock of half the world in a single season. It's still there in cliff faces and road cuts and quarry walls if you know how to look for it. You can still lay your hand flat against it, and nearly everything we are about to walk through was laid down on the far side of that thin grey line. In the hills of central Italy, above the old town of Gubbio, a gorge cuts through pale, rose-coloured limestone, rock that was once the floor of a warm sea. It is built almost entirely out of the dead, the chalky shells of countless tiny creatures, most no bigger than a grain of sand, that drifted down for tens of millions of years and settled, layer on patient layer, into stone. In the 1970s, a geologist named Walter Alvarez used to climb up to that rock face and read it with his hands. He could run his fingers up through the last stretch of the age of dinosaurs, a few thousand years at a time, until they always met the same thing at a certain height, a seam of soft grey clay about as thick as a fingernail. Below it, the stone was crowded with those tiny shells. Above it, for a long stretch of rock, they had all but disappeared. Something had happened at the level of that clay, and whatever it was, it had emptied the sea. That grey seam is not only in Italy. It turns up all over the world, always at the same moment in the rock, always marking the same great disappearance. It is the line where the age of dinosaurs ends and our own era begins, the floor that the whole age of mammals is built upon. And the question Walter Alvarez could not put down was a simple one, almost a child's question. How long did it take? Was the clay a slow thing, gathered over 1,000,000 quiet years as an old world faded out? Or was it fast, a single, sudden closing of a door? To find out, he needed a clock. He needed some ingredient in the clay that fell from the sky at a steady, known rate, so that a thicker band would mean more time had passed. He took the problem to his father. Luis Alvarez was a physicist, a Nobel laureate, a man who had spent his life measuring things almost too faint to be measured, and he suggested a candidate his son would never have reached for on his own, a metal called iridium. Iridium is one of the rarest things in the Earth's crust. When the young planet was still molten, almost all of it sank down with the iron into the core, far beyond our reach, and left the thin skin of rock we live on nearly bare of it. But iridium is not rare everywhere. Out among the asteroids and comets, it survives in far greater quantity. The original recipe the whole Earth was mixed from before the sorting. A slow, faint rain of cosmic dust is always sifting down onto the planet, carrying a trace of it. Measure the iridium in the clay, the two of them reasoned, and you could measure the years. They gave the clay to two chemists at the laboratory in Berkeley, Frank Asaro and Helen Michel, who had a way of finding vanishingly small amounts of an element hidden inside a pinch of rock. Everyone expected a small number. What came back was not small at all. The clay held about 30 times more iridium than the limestone around it, and when they tested a second site, a sea cliff in Denmark, the excess was more than 150 times. A streambed in New Zealand on the far side of the world told the same impossible story. That was the thing that stopped them. A gentle rain of cosmic dust could never do this. There was simply too much iridium spread across too much of the planet, and it had arrived far too fast for any slow sifting to explain. It had not gathered over 1 million years. It had come all at once, everywhere, in what must have been a single instant of geological time. And only one thing fit an arrival like that. Something very large and very rich in iridium had struck the Earth. For the two chemists at their bench in Berkeley, and for the father and son who had brought them the clay, it must have been a strange and disorienting moment. The ordinary work of weighing a rock had turned without warning into a glimpse of how a world had ended. In the paper they published in 1980, the Alvarezes were careful with what they claimed. They did not have the crater. They did not know where the object had come from or exactly what it had done in the hours after it fell. What they had was the iridium and the arithmetic it forced upon them. To lay down that much of the metal across a whole planet, the object would have had to be about 10 kilometers across, a mountain of rock and ice 6 or 7 miles wide falling out of the sky. It was set down plainly, almost quietly, and the numbers were left to carry the weight. It was at first an outrageous thing to say, a physicist and his son informing the world's geologists that a single rock from space had ended the reign of the dinosaurs. For 10 years the idea was picked at and doubted and tested against every gentler alternative. What slowly settled the argument was that the evidence kept arriving year after year, and every new piece of it pointed the same way. The iridium turned up at more than 300 sites around the globe, and then, at last, someone found the hole. The crater surfaced in 1991, hiding where no one had thought to look, not on the open ground, but buried, drowned beneath later rock and half beneath the sea, off the northern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It is called Chicxulub, after a small town that sits, all unknowing, near its center. It is about 180 kilometers across, wide enough that a person standing on one rim could never have seen the other. And when geologists finally drilled down into its heart a few years ago, they pulled up cores that held something extraordinary, the record of the impact's first day. More than 100 meters of shattered and melted and resettled rock dumped into the wound in a matter of hours. Near the top of it lay a thin dusting of charcoal, the ash of forests that had burned hundreds of kilometers away and drifted back down onto the water. They called it, without any exaggeration, the first day of the Cenozoic, the first day of our own age of the world. We can date that day now with a precision that feels almost impossible for something so old. It happened 66 million years ago, and we have it pinned to within about 11,000 years. That is not a short window in itself. 11,000 years is longer than the whole span of human civilization, from the first planted field to this very night. And yet, set against 66 million, it is a sliver almost too fine to picture. Think of it this way. It is as if you could know the age of a lifelong friend, not to the year they were born, but to within a few days of the morning. There is still real argument about the finer details of what the impact actually did, about the exact machinery of the dying. The strike itself was only local. What made it a catastrophe for the whole planet was what it flung into the sky. Rock vaporized and thrown clear around the world, and a haze of fine dust and soot and sulfur that dimmed the sun for years. Photosynthesis faltered, and the green engine of the world stalled. Whether it was mostly the sulfur or the dust or the smoke that did the most harm, the science is still patiently working out. But about the largest fact, there is no argument at all. 3 out of every 4 species then alive did not cross that line of clay. And this is the strange weight to carry right at the start of everything that follows. That whole ending, the close of a world that had run for 150 million years, is written into the rock as one grey line about a centimetre thick. You could hide it behind a single finger. The 10 million years of the Paleocene and the 56 million years that came after, and every mammal that has ever drawn breath. All of it is stacked on the far side of a seam you could cover with one hand. Everything below the line is the old world. Everything above it is us. The fire was over in a day. What came after, the years, the centuries, the slow return of anything green to a scorched and silent world, took very much longer. And it is there, in that long quiet after the fire, that the Paleocene truly begins. Picture a single fern uncurling from a bed of grey mud. It is a small, ordinary thing, a green fist opening slowly into a frond, the way ferns have opened for 400 million years, since long before there were forests or flowers, or feet to walk among them. There is bare ground all around it, and ash worked into the ground, and very little else that is alive. But the fern does not need much. Give it a little moisture and a little light, and it will hold on where almost nothing else can. Now step back and let the view widen. That one fern is not alone. It belongs to a plain of ferns that runs to the horizon and beyond. A low, soft green country standing where forest had been only a few years before. Walk out into that country, and the strangeness of it is all in the sameness. The same few kinds of fern, repeating and repeating, mile after mile, over a stricken world. And if you could keep going, over what would one day be Montana, then across an ocean, then out the far side of the planet, you would keep meeting the ferns, the same monotony of green wherever you looked. For a brief window after the fire, this was the face of the earth. The ground beneath all that green was soft and dark, half mud, half ash, still holding the fine grey dust that had fallen out of the sky. Nothing competed with the ferns because almost nothing else was left. They flooded the whole scoured surface, pouring into every open acre and taking it for their own. It was not a forest at all, but something simpler and stranger, a single kind of life spread thin across a whole world. The fern's advantage in a ruined world is in how it travels and how it begins. It does not grow from a seed the way a flowering plant does. It grows from a spore, a single cell finer than dust, so light that the wind lifts it in the millions and carries it for hundreds of miles. Those spores can lie in the soil for years, waiting, and then wake all together when the conditions turn right. A fern asks for no partner, no pollinator, no established soil to root in. The spore will take hold on bare rock, on cooling ash, on mud, with nothing else living in it at all. When a forest is stripped down to nothing, the fern is very often the first thing to return. Not because it is strong, but because it is patient, needs almost nothing, and was already there in the ground, waiting. We know all of this because ferns leave a record that lasts. Their spores are tough little capsules, and they survive in rock long after the ferns themselves have rotted away. Dust-sized fossils, still recognizable under a microscope tens of millions of years later. So you can take a core of rock straight down through the boundary and count the plants, grain by grain, on either side of that thin grey line. Just below the line, the count is rich and varied. The pollen of a full forest, dozens of kinds of flowering plants and trees, a whole living community pressed into the stone. Right at the line, that variety falls off a cliff, and in the layer immediately above, in place after place around the world, the sample becomes almost nothing but fern. In one well-studied stretch of rock along the border of Colorado and New Mexico, fern spores account for around 1/10 of the grains in the forest below, an ordinary share for a living forest floor. In the ash layer just above, they are well over 90% of everything preserved, and in some samples, 99%. almost every single grain a fern. Scientists have a name for that sudden, lopsided signature. They call it the fern spike. There is a peculiar frustration in reading a layer like this. The fern spike tells us the forests fell, and roughly how completely, but the rock keeps almost nothing of the very worst of it. Those years when the sky was darkest, when the ground was coldest and barest, when whatever was dying fastest. They are the thinnest, poorest pages in the whole book. Very little lives through a catastrophe, and very little of what lives leaves anything behind. So we read the disaster mostly by its edges, the diverse world that stops at the line, and the stripped, fern-choked world that begins just above it. The middle, the actual dying, is mostly a silence in the rock. And yet the fern spike, for all its bleakness, is really a measure of how hard it is to kill a plant. The same signature turns up on the far side of the world, in the rock of New Zealand, which is how we know the forests came down everywhere and not across one continent alone. But wherever the counting has been done, the deeper result holds. Across those regions, the forests were flattened and the diversity crashed. Whole communities of plants vanished from whole areas for a very long time, yet almost no major group was lost for good. Flowering plants survived, so did the conifers. The lineages that had built the forests were cut back to their roots and their buried seeds, and then, given a little time and a little warmth, they stood up again. Whatever forests eventually returned would not be quite the ones that had fallen, but they would be forests still, tall and layered and full of life. And the humble green that had held the ground for them would sink back to the stream banks and the shadows and wait, as it always has, for the next time the world breaks and needs beginning again. None of it lasted long. The reign of the ferns, the whole strange interval when the dominant plant on Earth was for a moment a single humble kind of green, may have run for only about 1,000 years. The estimates are loose, and some stretch it many times longer. 1,000 years is the tightest reading we have. But even at the long end, it is nothing at all. It is a held breath in the life of a planet 4.5 billion years old. The moment when the whole living surface reset itself to ferns was over almost before it began. It left behind only a thin green film across a wounded world, soon buried under the returning forests and pressed, over ages, into a few centimeters of stone. The land was not the only thing that had emptied. Out in the oceans, the same catastrophe was running, and the sea holds a clearer memory of it than the land does. A living ocean keeps its surface busy, a haze of tiny drifting plants and animals, blooming and dying and sinking, sending a constant slow rain of carbon down into the dark. That rain is part of what keeps the top of the sea and the bottom of the sea chemically unlike each other. It is a sign that the ocean is alive and working, sorting itself, breathing. After the impact, that rain very nearly stopped. So much of the tiny surface life died away that the whole system faltered. For a stretch of time, the shallow waters and the deep waters drifted toward the same flat, lifeless chemistry, as though the sea had lost the ability to tell its own surface from its own floor. Researchers gave that stalled-out ocean a strange and fitting name. They call it the Strangelove Ocean, a sea gone still and quiet and almost uniform from the sunlit shallows all the way to the bottom. The sea would take a long time to find its rhythm again, longer in the end than the land took to green over. But the plankton too had only been knocked down, not erased. In the mud of the deep sea floor, their tiny shells thin almost to nothing at the boundary, and then, little by little, they come back. So this was the world that had come through the fire, a green, unbroken quiet across the land, a flat and silent stillness through the sea. Empty, very nearly, but not entirely, Because down among the fern stems, in the leaf litter and the burrows and the muddy edges of the water, something was still moving. The fire had not taken quite everything. A few small, unremarkable creatures had lived through the catastrophe that emptied the world, and every story the Paleocene has to tell begins with the same two questions. Who were they? And how, in a world stripped down to ferns and silence, did anything at all manage to survive? What kind of creature survives the end of a world? The easy guess is the strong one, the big, the armored, the fierce, the animal built to force its way through anything. And the easy guess is wrong. When the sky darkened and the food failed from the bottom up, being large and powerful was not a shield. If anything, it was the surest way to die. The future of life on land did not run through the mighty. It ran through the small, the overlooked, the ones that had spent the whole age of dinosaurs in the margins, keeping out of the way. Every warm-blooded animal alive today, every mammal on Earth, ourselves included, is descended not from the rulers of that lost world, but from its refugees. Something close to 3/4 of all the species then alive were erased, and in some well-studied stretches of rock, the mammals lost more than 9 in 10. But the erasing was not even-handed, and that is exactly why a recovery was possible at all. The catastrophe worked like a sieve. It did not take life at random. It sorted it, holding one kind of creature back and letting the rest fall through. Look closely at what passed and what did not, and the shape of that sieve comes clear. You can read in the list of the survivors precisely what it took to live. It began with the sun. For a time after the impact, the dust and soot in the high air thinned the light, and the one process that feeds almost all of life, photosynthesis, the making of food out of sunlight, slowed and in places nearly stopped. When that fails, the collapse climbs upward from the bottom. The plants go first, then the animals that eat plants, then the animals that eat them in turn. In a famine like that, a large body is a liability because it burns a great deal of food to stay alive, and there was almost none to be had. The specialists starved as well. The animal that could eat only one kind of leaf or hunt only one kind of prey had nowhere to turn once its single food was gone. The dinosaurs were not weak. They had ruled the land for 150 million years, a success almost beyond imagining. A reign that makes the whole human story look like a single afternoon. But their success had been built on a living, growing world, and it had been built large. A great plant-eater needed tons of greenery every week. The hunters that fed on the plant-eaters needed the plant-eaters. When the plants went, the whole towering structure came down from the top, floor by floor, in an order as plain as arithmetic. Being the ruler of the old world turned out to be the single worst thing an animal could be. So the sieve favored the opposite of a ruler. It favored the small, whose bodies asked for little and could be kept going on a handful of seeds or insects. It favored the generalists, the ones that would eat almost anything, a beetle or a fallen nut, a rotting scrap or a worm turned up out of the mud. Vanishing underground helped too. Down in a burrow, where the killing cold and the deepest dark could not follow, a small creature could close its eyes and simply wait. But the surest advantage of all belonged to the animals that had never leaned on the living, sunlit food to begin with. That last group is the surprising one, and it points to where a great deal of the survival actually happened: in the water. A river or a pond does not run on sunlight the way a meadow or a forest does. It runs in large part on death, on the steady drift of dead leaves and twigs, and washed in debris that feeds the small things at the bottom of the chain, whether the sun is shining or not. So when the light failed and the land starved, the streams and the swamps kept quietly turning over, fed by the litter of the world that had just ended. The animals that lived in that water or fed at its edges were buffered from the worst of it. This is why so many of the survivors, when you sort them out, turn out to be creatures of the freshwater margins. Turtles, the long-snouted relatives of crocodiles, slender water reptiles built like the gharials of today, amphibians down in the mud. The pond outlasted the forest. This is a pattern that repeats whenever the world is badly broken. Life does not vanish evenly. It pulls back into the places the disaster cannot reach, underground, underwater, into the cold and the mud and the dark, and holds there in refuges until the surface is safe again. The great extinctions are not clean sweeps, they are sieves. And what comes through is never simply the old world carried on, but a strange, thinned out, reshuffled remnant. A handful of the overlooked, waiting to become something the world has never seen. Ask yourself what it would have taken for you to come through that boundary alive. You would have had to be small enough to hide in a crack in the ground and to keep yourself alive on almost nothing at all. A stomach that could handle anything would have helped. So would a burrow deep enough to shut out the cold and the dark, along with the patience to stay down inside it in the black and wait for the world to change its mind. Every quality that might have made you impressive in the old order, size, strength, a place at the top of the food chain, would, when the whole world was a famine, have marked you for death. Greatness counted for nothing. Getting by counted for everything. When the counting is done and the survivors are laid out, 4 kinds of mammal come through the boundary. 4 small threads of warm-blooded life that had shared the world with the dinosaurs, always in the undergrowth, always after dark. One was a tribe of rodent-like creatures called multituberculates, named for the bumpy, grinding teeth that let them get by on almost any kind of plant. Another was the line of the pouched mammals, the ancestors and cousins of today's opossums and kangaroos. A third was the egg-laying mammals, that strange branch whose only survivors now are the platypus and the spiny echidnas. And the fourth was the placental line, the branch that keeps its young inside the body until they are ready, and the branch, as it happens, that leads all the way to us. There is a kind of quiet justice in this, if you go looking for it, though the earth was not handing out justice, only consequences. For 150 million years these mammals had lived in the shadow of the giant reptiles, small and cautious and largely unremarkable, waiting out the long reign of something else. They were never the point of that old world. They were the footnotes to it. And then the world that had kept them small fell away in a single season, and the very things that had kept them humble, their smallness, their plainness, their knack for making do, turned out to be the only things worth having. Endurance is a quieter virtue than dominance. It rarely looks like much while it is happening, but over deep time, again and again, it is endurance and not dominance that has the last word. So picture one of them now, at the far end of the worst year the world had ever known. Down in its burrow it is dark and cold at the entrance, and quiet in a way the earth had not been quiet in a very long time. The creature is no bigger than a mouse. Its heart runs fast to keep it warm, because warmth is one of the few things it still has, and warmth in that starving dark is a kind of wealth. It cannot know that the sky above is beginning to clear, or that the ferns are already greening the ground over its head, or that the forests will follow them in time. Least of all can it know that the whole future of life on land is folded up small and breathing inside its narrow ribs. It knows only how to wait, and for now, waiting is enough. The waiting did not last as long as you might think. Down in the burrows and along the stream banks, the small survivors held on through the dark. Then the dark thinned. The sun came back. The ferns gave way to shoots and saplings, and the world quietly reopened. What happened next is one of the most surprising things in the whole record of life, and for a long time, no one could see it clearly. The recovery was fast. Not fast the way a season is fast, but fast in the way that startles a geologist. Within about 100,000 years of the worst day the land had ever known, the mammals had already doubled in their variety. The largest of them had grown back to the size of a raccoon, all the way to where they had stood before the sky ever fell. We can watch that comeback happen almost frame by frame because of an extraordinary run of rock in Colorado in a place called Corral Bluffs. For most of the last century, the earliest Paleocene was a maddening blank to the people who study it. The animals of the recovery were small, their bones were fragile, and the rock of those first hundreds of thousands of years seemed to hold almost nothing but scraps. A tooth here, a splinter of jaw there. You could work a site like that for years and come away with a shoebox of fragments. Then, in 2016, a paleontologist named Tyler Lyson, working out of the Denver Museum, changed the one thing that mattered. He stopped looking for bone in the flat grey rock and started cracking open the concretions, the hard, egg-shaped stone nodules that lie scattered through it, the kind of lump most people would step over without a glance. Inside the very first ones he split, staring back at him, were skulls. Whole, uncrushed mammal skulls sealed inside the stone like walnuts in a shell. In a single afternoon, he and his colleagues found 4 of them, 4 complete skulls from a stretch of time that had, until that day, given up almost nothing. There is a particular joy in a find like that, and it is not hard to imagine. A person who has spent years turning over grey rubble for scraps, kneeling in the dirt with a rock hammer, breaking a plain stone lump in 2, and finding, looking back at them out of 66 million years, an entire face. What those skulls opened up was not just a handful of new fossils. It was a clock. Corral Bluffs turned out to preserve a continuous, finely dated record of the first million years after the impact. Thousands of animal bones, thousands of fossil leaves, tens of thousands of grains of pollen, all stacked in order and readable together. When Lyson and the paleobotanist Ian Miller laid it out in sequence, they saw a world climbing back in distinct steps. The first of those steps we have already glimpsed. By 100,000 years, the mammals had doubled in kind and regained their raccoon size, keeping pace with the spread of the first palm forests. At around 300,000 years, the largest of them tripled in weight again, and right alongside that jump, in the pollen, the walnut family arrived, scattering hard, oil-rich nuts across the forest floor. By 700,000 years, the biggest mammals were the size of a large dog, close to 50 kilograms, and in that same layer appear the first legumes, the bean family, another dense parcel of protein laid on the table of the world. It is a strange and moving thing to see, set out in the rock like that. We almost never get to watch recovery as a process. Usually the record is too coarse, too full of gaps, and we are left comparing a world before with a world long after, the healing itself lost in between. Corral Bluffs gives the healing back. You can follow it layer by layer, like the frames of a slow film. The plants reinventing what food could be, packing more and more energy into nuts and beans and fruit. The animals swelling, generation after generation, to live on the richer fare. A whole community hauling itself upward together out of almost nothing. The mammals did not grow on their own. They grew because the forest kept setting a better table, and every time it did, some animal rose to meet it. In under 1 million years, the largest land mammals went from the size of a rat to the size of a boar, a 100-fold gain in weight, read almost step by step. And it was not only size that came back. The animals were reinventing how to make a living, some turning to the new nuts and seeds with heavy, grinding teeth, some to leaves, some to insects, some to one another. A single kind of small, hungry survivor was fanning out into dozens of different trades, filling a world that had been swept clean of nearly everything that once did those jobs. There is a lesson folded into that speed, and it runs against a common intuition. We tend to imagine that a shattered world takes an eternity to knit itself back together, that after a catastrophe on that scale, the Earth must lie broken for tens of millions of years. The rock says otherwise. Given survivors, given a little warmth, and given time measured in the low hundreds of thousands of years rather than the millions, life does not merely persist. It elaborates. It reaches back toward complexity almost eagerly, as though richness were the resting state of the living world, and emptiness only ever a temporary condition. Somewhere in that rebuilding world, not at Corral Bluffs but in the rock of what is now Montana, lived a small, unassuming animal that matters to us more than any of the rest. Its name is Purgatorius, and it is one of the earliest creatures we can place, with any confidence, on the branch that leads to the primates, to the lemurs and the monkeys and the great apes, and at the far end of the same branch, to us. It was tiny, no bigger than a mouse, small enough to sit in the palm of a cupped hand, and it is known mostly from its teeth, which speak of a diet of insects and soft fruit. Its age is the astonishing part. The oldest fossils of it that we have date to somewhere between about 105,000 and 140,000 years after the impact. And it was not creeping about on the forest floor. A few of its ankle bones, found and studied more recently, are built for climbing, for gripping and twisting, and moving surely through branches. Purgatorius lived in the trees. Nearly everything that would one day define the primates, the grasping hands, the forward-facing eyes, the trust in sight over smell, the long, slow childhood spent learning a complicated world, has a distant root in the plain demand of moving through a canopy without falling. It all began up there, in an animal smaller than a squirrel, within roughly 130,000 years of the day the sky came down. Hold that for a moment. The forests those trees belonged to were only a few 100,000 years old. In geological terms, the ash of the old world was still warm, and already in the branches there was a small, quick, warm-blooded animal, no heavier than an apple, with hands made for gripping, doing the oldest primate thing there is, climbing toward the light and the fruit at the top of it. That animal, or one much like it, is where your family album begins. Follow your own ancestry back far enough, past the first farmers, past the painters in the caves, past the upright walkers on the African grass, and it does not stop until it reaches a creature you could have cupped in two hands, alive in a forest that had only just finished burning. You are the far end of that climb. The recovery written in the rock at Corral Bluffs and the little climber in the Montana trees are not someone else's history. They are the first pages of yours. But it would be a mistake to think that these small ancestors of ours were the main event. They were not. For all that the primate line was already quietly climbing, the great recovery of the Paleocene did not belong to us, nor to anything a modern eye would know how to name in a forest. In the long millions of years that opened out beyond those first astonishing centuries, the land filled instead with other creatures altogether, large, strange, and now entirely vanished. They were the true rulers of the rebuilt world, and they are the ones almost no one remembers. For several million years, a span longer than our own kind has existed, the land belonged to animals that almost no one has heard of. They were not rare and they were not marginal. They were the lords of the recovering world, filling it from the stream banks to the treetops, and they held it for longer than there have been human beings to walk anywhere at all. And yet, not one of them has a name you would know. None appears on a lunchbox or a museum poster or a child's storybook. Not one has left a single living descendant to carry its memory forward. For a while they ruled the whole world, and then they left it just as completely, taking even their names with them. Walk into a Paleocene forest, then, and try to name what you see. It will not go well. There is a solid, sheep-sized animal rooting in the leaf mold with a blunt, heavy head, but it is not a pig, and it is not a tapir, and it is the ancestor of neither. Something the size of a large cat is picking its way along a branch overhead, with the quick hands and long tail you might expect of a squirrel. But its teeth are all wrong, and it belongs to no family a modern zoo has ever kept. Down among the roots, a stout, clawed digger is turning up tubers with the front end of a badger and the teeth of nothing alive today. You would know the general shapes: climber, digger, browser, gnawer, because those are the trades a forest always needs filled. But the animals filling them would be strangers to you, everyone. This is the fact that the textbooks used to skate past, and that our tidy mental picture still gets wrong. The story most of us picked up somewhere is simple. The dinosaurs died, the mammals were free at last, and they set about becoming the animals we know, the first horses, the first cats, the whole modern world clicking into place. It is a satisfying story. It is also, for the first several million years, almost entirely untrue. The mammals that inherited the Paleocene were not early drafts of the modern orders. They were something else, whole dynasties of creatures that would rise, rule, and disappear without leaving a single living heir, while the animals we would recognize spent that entire stretch as minor players in the wings. It helps to think of the Paleocene as a first draft of the age of mammals, written quickly, in the flush of an emptied world, and then almost entirely crossed out and written over. The forms that fill it are the discarded sentences of that draft, tried, kept for a while, and finally set aside. And like discarded drafts everywhere, they are often stranger and bolder than the fair copy that replaced them. So it is worth walking among them a little, before they are gone for good, meeting a few of the dynasties that held this world and lost it. Take the most successful of them, a group we have already met in passing, the multituberculates. Their name is a mouthful, but it only describes their teeth, rows of small bumps or tubercles that made a fine mill for grinding up seeds and leaves and roots. They were not rodents, though they lived a rodent's kind of life. They belonged to a branch of the mammal tree all their own, one that had been running since the middle of the age of dinosaurs. When the asteroid came, they were among the handful of survivors, and in the quiet world that followed, they flourished as never before. For millions of years, the multituberculates were everywhere underfoot, the little grinding engines of the Paleocene forest floor. The largest of them grew to the size and heft of a beaver, which, for a group whose ancestors had spent 100 million years no bigger than a mouse, was a kind of triumph. And then, slowly, they faded. As the world warmed and changed, a newer kind of animal appeared, the true rodents, the rats and squirrels and their kin, who did the same job a little better, bred a little faster, and pressed in from every side. Over the following tens of millions of years, the multituberculates dwindled and went out, one lineage at a time, until the most enduring dynasty of mammals the world had ever produced was simply gone. They had lasted well over 100 million years. Nothing you could point to today carries their line. If the multituberculates worked the small end of the forest, the middle belonged to a sprawling, awkward assemblage we lump together as the condylarths. The name is almost an admission of defeat. It is a label for archaic hoofed mammals we cannot sort cleanly into anything, a wastebasket into which scientists have swept the plant-eaters and omnivores of the early Paleocene that refuse to line up with the groups that came later. They ranged from things the size of a cat to things the size of a sheep, walking on blunt little hooves, cropping leaves and cracking seeds, and in some, eating whatever a hungry animal will eat. They were the cattle and the pigs and the deer of their world, except that they were none of those things and gave rise to almost none of them. A few threads did run forward out of that tangle. Somewhere among the condylarths, most likely, lie the beginnings of the odd-toed hoofed animals, the distant forerunners of horses and rhinos, and a scattering of other modern lines. But these were the exceptions, faint threads in a great vanished weave. The overwhelming majority of the condylarths were their own beginning and their own end, a bestiary of solid, unremarkable grazers, chewing through a world that would not keep them. Stranger still were the teniodonts, the diggers. These were stocky, muscular animals built around a single idea, getting at the food that hides underground. They had powerful forelimbs and heavy claws for tearing into soil and blunt, ever-growing teeth for grinding through the gritty roots and tubers they hauled up. Some were modest. The later ones reached the size of a pig. There is nothing quite like them alive today. Reach for a cross between a ground sloth and a giant mole, and you will still fall short. They grubbed their way through the Paleocene and the Epoch after it, and in time they vanished as well, leaving only their strange bones and no descendants at all. And then there is the group that should feel closest to us, and somehow feels the strangest of all, the early cousins of the primates. Purgatorius, the little climber we met a moment ago, was one of the first of them, but it was far from the last. Over the Paleocene, they fanned out into dozens of forms, squirrel-like animals in the branches, some with gnawing front teeth like a rodent's, some with fingers and toes already turning toward the grasping hands the primates would one day be known for. One of them had a big toe tipped with a flat nail instead of a claw, curling around a branch in almost exactly the way your own hand curls around a rail. They were our aunts and uncles in the deep sense, the side branches of our own family, exploring the trees alongside our direct ancestors. And they too, nearly all died out, quietly, before the primate line proper had truly found its feet. None of these were failures. That is the thing to hold on to. A group that rules the land for millions of years has by any measure succeeded. It has done the one thing life is ever asked to do, which is to keep going and to fill a world with more of itself. The multituberculates and the condylarths and the taeniodonts were not biding their time in some anteroom, waiting for the real animals to arrive. As far as they were concerned, they were the real animals. The whole of the living world, complete and self-evident, certain of nothing so much as their own permanence. They ruled the land for longer than there has been anything you would call a human being, and they vanished so thoroughly that they have left no word for themselves in any language, no shape in any child's imagination, no living animal to stand in for them and say, this is roughly what they were. A whole successful world, several worlds really, one after another, swept clean off the surface of memory. The only place any of it survives now is in the rock, and in the small number of people who have learned how to read it. But there is one more thing the rock records about them, and it points the way onward. For all their variety, most of these animals stayed modest in size, cat-sized, dog-sized, sheep-sized at the most. The great empty spaces at the top, where the dinosaurs had once browsed the treetops and shaken the ground, stood open for a long time, unclaimed. And then, slowly, some of the forgotten dynasties began to test that empty height, and to grow larger than any mammal had ever been. The question the Paleocene had been quietly asking since the fire was about to be answered. With no giants left anywhere on Earth, which of the small survivors would dare to become one? On a warm morning about 62 million years ago, in a forest that stood where New Mexico is now, a large animal was giving birth. She was a heavy, thick-limbed creature, something like a sheep grown coarse and powerful, with a long head and a body built for shoving through undergrowth. What came into the world beneath her was not the blind, helpless pink thing a mouse or a kitten produces. Her calf arrived nearly finished. Within a short while it was up on its own legs, wet, unsteady but standing, with its eyes open and a working set of teeth already in its jaws. It could see the forest it had been born into. Before long it could follow its mother through it. This was an animal built to be ready, because the world it was entering did not wait for the unready. The forest around them was warm and wet and busy, thick with insects, dense with growing things, dripping steadily after rain. It was a young world still, only a few million years past its ruin, rich in green and short on giants. Into it the calf stood up, shook itself, and began, without any idea that it was doing so, one of the fastest lives a large animal has ever lived. We know this calf, not its face and not its name. It had neither in any sense we would use, but we know its life in a detail that would have seemed impossible not long ago. This animal, a middle Paleocene beast called Paleocene, kept a record of itself without ever meaning to in its own teeth. Teeth grow the way trees grow, in fine daily layers that harden into a permanent private calendar. Locked inside those layers are chemical traces, faint signals of what was happening in the body on the day each layer formed. A team of scientists worked out, only recently, how to read that calendar. From a single tooth of a single Paleocene, dead for 62 million years, they recovered its life almost day by day. It works because the body cannot help leaving fingerprints. On the day the calf was born, a distinct pulse of one metal, zinc, was written into the forming tooth, a chemical birth certificate. Through the weeks it nursed, a different signal carried in its mother's milk rose and held, and then fell away sharply at the moment of weaning. Growth lines finer than a hair mark off the days in between. Read together, these are the pages of a life. Here is the morning it was born. Here are the weeks at its mother's side. Here is the day it was turned out to feed itself. And here, not many seasons later, is where the record simply ends. And it is a strangely familiar story. The calf had been carried inside its mother for around 7 months before birth. A long, patient pregnancy of the kind we think of as thoroughly modern, the kind a deer or a goat still keeps. It was born, as we saw, ready to run, in the way of a foal or a wildebeest calf that has to be on its feet within the hour or die. Then, for a month or two, no longer, it nursed. And after that it grew fast, matured young, and, in the case of the particular calf whose tooth was red, died young, still only a few years old. Its whole way of being alive comes down to a phrase we usually save for something more romantic. It lived fast, and it died young. It grew quickly, bred early, spent itself without stint, and did not linger. In such a raw, unsettled world, that was a sound bet. Better than growing slowly and gambling on a long, safe life the world was in no position to promise. There is something quietly astonishing in all of this. The way this animal made and raised its young, the long pregnancy, the single well-formed calf, the weeks of milk, the whole warm apparatus of placental birth, is essentially the way we still do it, and the way most familiar mammals still do it, 62 million years on. It was not new even then. By the time Paleocene was walking that New Mexico forest, the deep machinery of the mammalian body was already old, already settled, already recognizably ours. The dinosaurs had been gone only a few million years, and the mammals were not inventing themselves from nothing. They were scaling up something they had been carrying in miniature all along, and the life itself was short, startlingly short. This was one of the larger animals of its day, a heavyweight of the Paleocene forest. Its entire existence, from the morning it struggled up onto its legs to the day it lay down for the last time, was over in a handful of years. Its whole life beginning to end was shorter than your own childhood, shorter than the years you spent simply growing up, learning to read, learning to become yourself. It had no luxury of slowness, and almost nothing in the Paleocene did, and yet, folded into those few fast years was the entire modern plan of a mammal's existence, born, weaned, grown and gone, exactly as we are, only quicker. Pantolambda belonged to a group called the pantodonts, and the pantodonts are the answer to the question the empty world had been asking. They were among the very first mammals to grow truly large after the dinosaurs, to move up into the huge, ungrazed heights that had stood open since the giants fell. Pantolambda itself was only sheep-sized, a beginning rather than a summit, but its relatives kept climbing. Within a few million years, the pantodonts had produced heavy, hippo-like browsers the size of an ox, wallowing in the swamps and stripping the low branches bare, and later still one of them reached the bulk of a modern rhinoceros. For the first time since the fire, the ground had something heavy walking on it again. The stage the dinosaurs had left bare was filling back in from the top down, not with dinosaurs, and not with anything that had existed before, but with these warm-blooded newcomers feeling their way toward a size no mammal had ever tried. It is easy to pass over how large a milestone that was. A big body is an expensive thing to run. It needs a great deal of food reliably, day after day and year after year, which means it needs a world grown stable and productive enough to keep a giant fed. For 10 million years, no land animal had been able to count on such abundance. So the sheer heaviness of the pantodonts was itself a kind of message, written in muscle and bone. The recovery had reached all the way to the top. The forests were deep enough now and rich enough to carry real weight again. The pantodonts would not last forever. Like almost everything in this epoch, they would in time thin out and disappear. But for a long green stretch of the Paleocene, they were the living proof that the world had filled back up. But step back from the animal for a moment. Back from the sheep-sized calf on its unsteady legs. Back from the hippo-like browsers wading in the swamps. And a larger question opens up behind them. It takes a particular kind of world to grow a giant, and to grow one this quickly. It takes warmth and rain, and deep, unhurried forests running on and on without a hard winter to stop them. The Paleocene had all of that, in almost unimaginable measure. To understand how the recovery could climb so high, so fast, we have to lift our eyes from the creatures moving through the forest and look instead at the strange, warm, ice-free planet that was holding them all up. Through the whole length of the Paleocene, there was no ice at the North Pole. There was none at the South Pole either, and little to speak of on any mountain in between. No ice sheets, no glaciers grinding down the valleys, no white caps at the top and bottom of the planet. Where there is now a frozen ocean ringed by tundra, there stood forests, real forests, of tall trees, right at the very roof of the world. The poles of the Paleocene wore woods where they now wear ice. That single fact, ice-free poles, is the doorway into just how different this world was. Warmth had spread everywhere. Its average temperature sat somewhere around 26 degrees Celsius against a modern average nearer 15. The air held perhaps twice as much carbon dioxide as it does now, a thick blanket of gas that kept the heat in. But the raw numbers understate the strangeness because they do not tell you where the warmth was. A hot equator is no surprise. The strange part is that the cold had almost nowhere left to live. Today, the Earth is a planet of ferocious contrasts. Stand on the equator and the average warmth is around 30 degrees. Stand at either pole and it is 30 or 40 below. That gulf, 60 or 70 degrees of difference between the middle of the world and its ends, is what drives our storms, our seasons, our jet streams, the whole restless machinery of modern weather. The Paleocene had almost none of it. The equator was hot, a shade hotter even than today's tropics. But the truly startling difference was at the ends of the Earth, where the poles sat mild and green, tens of degrees warmer than they had any business being. Climate scientists have a word for a world like that. They call it equable, evenly warm, gently graded, soft from the middle all the way out to the edges. How a planet keeps its poles that warm is not fully settled even now. It is one of the genuine puzzles of this old greenhouse. A thick, carbon-rich atmosphere holds heat in everywhere, which is part of it. And a warm, wet world is very good at moving heat around. Warm ocean currents and a heavy, restless atmosphere carry the sun's energy away from the equator and spill it out across the high latitudes, warming the ends of the Earth far more than the middle. With no bright sheets of ice to throw the sunlight back into space, the poles held on to still more of what little reached them. However it all worked in full, the result is not in doubt. A world warmed almost evenly, from one end of it to the other. Go and stand there in the far north of that world, and it is stranger than any number can convey. You are inside a forest of tall conifers and dawn redwoods, with broad-leaved trees between them and ferns underfoot, growing out of soft, wet, dark soil. The ground is warm and the air is mild. And yet you are at the top of the planet, and the sky above you is doing something a forest sky should not be able to do. For months at a stretch, in the depth of winter, the sun never rises at all. The tilt of the Earth was the same then as now, so the poles still swung through their long darkness and their long light. But here, the darkness came without the deep cold. These forests lived through months of warm, sunless winter, holding on in the dim. And then they broke into a frenzy of growth when the sun came up and refused to set again, feeding all day and all night on light that never stopped, throwing on a whole year of growth in a few frantic sunlit months. It is one of the most alien rhythms in the entire history of life on land. A warm forest in the endless dark, waiting for the endless day. Nor did the warmth stop at the shoreline. The deep ocean today is a near freezing dark, black and only a degree or two above zero, chilled by cold water that sinks at the poles and creeps along the floor of the world. In the Paleocene there was no such cold water to sink because the poles themselves were not cold, so the deep sea was warm as well, perhaps 8 or 10 or 12 degrees the whole way down. A warm abyss, from the sunlit surface to the lightless floor, is one of the harder things about this world for a modern mind to hold. The cold that fills most of the ocean's volume today, the cold that most life on this planet actually lives in, simply was not there. Even the temperate middle of the world was nothing like ours. The regions that now endure hard winters, much of North America, much of Europe and Asia, lay under warm, humid forest that stayed green the year round. There were seasons of a sort, wetter spells and drier, longer days and shorter. But the killing frost, the snow, the long months when the living world shuts down and waits, those were simply gone from most of the planet. Winter, in the sense we mean it, had been softened almost out of existence, and the warmth was still climbing as the epoch wore on. By its end, and into the hotter world that followed, the reach of warm, loving life had pushed even further toward the poles. Palms, with their tropical need for a winter that never freezes, grew at latitudes now locked under ice. The relatives of crocodiles and alligators, cold-blooded animals that cannot survive a hard freeze, were living and hunting inside what is now the Arctic Circle. Picture that, a crocodile-like reptile basking on a warm riverbank in a northern forest at a latitude where a modern winter would kill it in a single night. That is not a small adjustment to the planet. It is a different planet altogether. A world built like that is an easy one to live in, or at least an easy one to spread across. There were no brutal winters to survive, no killing frosts to wall the warm-blooded creatures into the tropics. Forests ran almost unbroken from the equator to the edges of the poles, one great band of green with the harsh extremes filed off both ends. Warmth-loving plants and animals could push toward the poles and simply stay. And this is the world, remember, in which the mammals were rebuilding themselves and reaching, for the first time, toward real size. The mildness of the climate is a large part of why that recovery could go as far as it did, and as fast. It is easier to grow a giant and to keep it fed in a world that never freezes. It is tempting to think of all this as some rare, feverish exception, a freak warm spell in the Earth's long story. It was not. Pull far enough back, and it is not the warm, ice-free Paleocene that looks strange. It is us. For most of the last few 100 million years, the planet has run warm and open and largely free of ice, much as it did then. The frozen poles we take for granted, the ice caps and the glaciers and the sharp cold seasons, those are the recent and unusual thing, a chill the Earth slid into only tens of millions of years later. All of human history has unfolded inside that chill, in an unusually cold chapter of a mostly warm world. When we look at the Paleocene, we are not looking at an aberration. We are looking, in a sense, at the planet's more usual face, with the ice simply switched off. But if the poles were the great surprise of this world, the tropics were its furnace. The equator sat at the top of a planet with no cool anywhere to balance it. A wet, blazing, unrelenting heat, held day and night and season after season, with nothing like a cold snap ever to break it. Heat like that leaves marks. It shapes what can live and how large, and it presses itself into flesh and bone. And in one river valley near the equator, in the sweltering green of what is now northern Colombia, that heat grew something so far past the ordinary that no one, at first, could quite believe it. When its bones were finally lifted out of the rock, they seemed to carry the temperature of the vanished world written inside them. Near the Caribbean coast, in the far north of Colombia, there is a hole in the ground so large it can be seen from space. It is the largest open-pit coal mine in the world, a huge terraced pit chewed out of the tropical lowlands, layer by black layer. It is a brutal place to work. The equatorial sun stands almost straight overhead. The air hangs thick and wet and close to 40 degrees, and the coal dust gets into everything. You would feel the heat here long before you noticed anything else. A heavy, pressing, tropical heat that never really lets go. And it was in exactly that heat, in the early years of this century, that a team of scientists began pulling impossible things out of the freshly cut rock. The rock they were cutting through was about 58 million years old, and it had once been the floor of a steaming river valley near the equator. Among the fossils it gave up were vertebrae, the interlocking bones of some large animal's spine, and a few of them were so big that, at first, the scientists set them aside as belonging to a crocodile. It was only when a snake specialist named Jason Head studied their shape that the truth came clear, and it was not an easy truth to accept. These were not crocodile bones at all. They were the backbones of a snake. And when Head worked out how large a snake would have to be to carry a vertebra like that, the figure he reached lay so far outside anything alive that it seemed for a moment more likely he had made a mistake. The animal is called Titanoboa, and it is the largest snake the world has ever known. From nose to tail, it reached something like 13 meters, the length of a city bus. At its thickest, around the middle, it was as broad as a grown person's waist, a barrel of muscle you could not have got your arms around. It weighed more than a ton, the heaviest snake alive today. A big green anaconda might stretch to 5 or 6 meters and weigh a small fraction as much. Titanoboa was in another category altogether, a snake scaled up past the point where a snake is supposed to be able to work at all. To meet it, you have to leave the coal mine and step back into the world the coal remembers. A hot, wet, sprawling river delta, threaded with slow brown channels and shaded by the tall trees of the earliest rainforest. It was a world built to a larger scale than ours. In the water beside Titanoboa, there were turtles the size of a small car, their shells more than 1.5 meters across. There were crocodile-like reptiles too, some small enough for the snake to swallow, and one kind that grew to 6 meters or more, large enough to be a rival rather than a meal. Lungfish 3 meters long moved through the shallows, and many of these, the turtles, the crocodile kin, belonged to the very lineages that had slipped through the freshwater refuges when the old world burned, growing, in the millions of years since, into giants of their own. Picture it moving. A snake of that length does not dart, it flows, a slow river of muscle sliding through the shallows, its back breaking the brown surface like a line of low islands. It could go a long time without feeding. And when it did feed, it did so the way the great constrictors still do, not with venom, but with sheer patient strength, taking hold of an animal that had come down to drink and closing around it until the struggle stopped. In those warm, crowded rivers, nothing else was large enough to trouble it. For a long stretch of the Paleocene, in that one green corner of the equator, the biggest and most formidable animal on land or in the water was a snake that weighed more than a horse. So why was it so enormous? The answer that made Titanoboa famous is also the reason it belongs here, at the hot heart of a hot world. A snake is a cold-blooded animal. It makes almost no heat of its own. Its body runs at the temperature of the air and water around it, and so does its metabolism, the slow inner chemistry that keeps it alive. For a cold-blooded animal, there is a ceiling on how large it can grow at any given temperature. Grow too big for the warmth on offer, and the sluggish chemistry of a cool, enormous body can no longer keep up with the work of staying alive. Warmth lifts that ceiling. The hotter the world, the larger a cold-blooded animal can afford to become. And so the scientists who described Titanoboa argued that its size was a measurement in disguise. To grow a snake that large, they reasoned, the Paleocene tropics must have averaged between 30 and 34 degrees the year round, hotter than any rainforest standing today. It is a lovely idea, and it may well be right, but we should be honest about how much weight a single animal can bear. Within a year or two of the snake's description, a group of other scientists pushed back on the very idea that its size could serve as a thermometer. A body that large, they noted, is not the simple passive thing the argument assumes. A 1-ton snake makes a little heat of its own and holds on to it, the way any great mass does, so its insides may have run somewhat warmer than the air around it. And if the snake ran warmer than the air, then the air did not need to be so hot after all. It could even have been a few degrees cooler than the famous figure. Others doubted the method itself, applied to certain giant fossil lizards. The same reasoning predicts climates those animals never actually lived in. The disagreement is genuine, and it has never been fully resolved. One extraordinary animal, it turns out, is a shakier instrument for measuring a whole world than it first appears. And yet the conclusion the snake pointed to has largely held because the snake was never the only witness. The heat of the Paleocene tropics can be read in things that have nothing to do with any animal's size. It is written into the chemistry of fossil seashells and into faint traces of long-dead microbes preserved in the mud of the old seafloor, and, most tellingly of all, into the shapes of fossil leaves pulled from the very same Serpent rocks. Leaves that grow in hotter, wetter places tend to have smoother, less jagged edges, and the leaves buried alongside Titanoboa carry exactly that tropical stamp. By 3 or 4 separate methods, not one of them a snake, the answer keeps returning the same. This was among the hottest lowland tropics the world has ever known, a place that ran year upon year above 30 degrees. The snake did not prove the heat single-handed, but it turned out to be telling the truth. There is a strange loop in all of this that is easy to miss. The scientists who dug Titanoboa out of the ground did it in that punishing 40-degree mine heat, streaming with sweat under the equatorial sun. And the world they were lifting from the rock had been almost exactly that hot. The heat pressing down on them as they worked was, in a quiet way, the same heat that had grown the snake, the modern equator standing in for the ancient one, the furnace of the tropics reaching across 60 million years to shake hands with itself. And there is something quietly staggering in that. Somewhere in the green swelter of the Paleocene, a snake grew so large that its body became a record of the world's warmth. Not on purpose, and not in any way it could ever know, but simply because heat and size were bound together in it, and a creature that big could only have been built by a world that hot. 60 million years on, the record is still readable. You can lift the vertebra out of the coal, weigh it in your hand, and be holding, in a real sense, the temperature of a lost afternoon at the equator, the heat of a whole world, still kept in the bones of the animal it grew. But the forest that grew Titanoboa did not come from nowhere. By 58 million years ago, it was already a mature rainforest, dense, tall, tangled and layered, recognizably the ancestor of the great tropical forests standing today. A forest like that has to be built, though, out of the ruins of something older. And to find the morning it began, we have to leave the snake in its warm river and travel back another 8 million years to the day the sky came down. Because the rainforest that Titanoboa hunted in, improbable as it sounds, was one more thing the asteroid made. Somewhere in the Amazon right now, a single leaf is falling. It drops through green light, through layer upon layer of leaves, 100 feet of tangled, dripping forest, and lands, at last, on a floor that has hardly seen the sky in a very long time. Above it stands one of the densest, tallest, most crowded structures the living world has ever built. The closed canopy of a tropical rainforest, a green roof pulled tight over a whole world beneath. The whole structure feels eternal, a thing that has always been and always will be. It is not. That closed green roof has a beginning, a date, almost a morning, and the morning it began was the worst one the Earth has ever known. We know this because of a remarkable piece of detective work published a few years ago by a team of scientists working in Colombia, the same warm corner of the world that would later hold Titanoboa. They gathered an enormous record of the tropical plants, more than 50,000 grains of fossil pollen, and more than 6,000 fossil leaves, from dozens of sites that reach across the boundary from the last of the Cretaceous into the Paleocene. Read together, that record is a before and after photograph of a rainforest taken across the worst day in its history, and the before and the after do not match. The forest that stood before the impact and the forest that grew after it were not the same forest at all. One had been quietly replaced by the other. Walk into the tropical forest of the late Cretaceous, the forest the last of the dinosaurs moved through, and it would not feel like a jungle at all. It was an open place. The trees stood well apart from one another, with room and light between them, and the sunshine fell all the way down to a floor of ferns and low green growth. It was a mixed wood too. Flowering plants grew there, but so did tall conifers and other older kinds of tree, and none of them was fully in charge. You could have walked through it in the light, the way you might walk through an open pine wood or a wooded park today, with patches of sky showing overhead the whole way. Now walk into the tropical forest a few million years later in the Paleocene, and the sky is gone. The trees have closed ranks. Flowering plants have taken over almost entirely. The conifers thinned out and largely disappeared. In their place came the legumes and the palms, packed in tight, reaching up and crowding together until their crowns met and locked overhead into one continuous roof. Down at the floor, where the sunlight used to reach, there is now a deep green dusk. This is the rainforest as we know it, layered, dim, dripping, every plant straining upward for its share of a light that barely gets through, and it had never existed before. It was built in that gap of a few million years out of the wreckage of the open world that came before it. The replacement was not quick. When the asteroid struck, the diversity of tropical plants crashed. Nearly half of all the kinds of plant in those forests were lost, and it took something like 6 million years for that diversity to climb back to where it had been. But when it climbed back into the new arrangement, denser, darker, ruled by the flowering plants, shaped like a modern rainforest rather than the open Cretaceous wood, and the change went deeper than the trees. It reached the insects that lived off them. Before the impact, the leaf-eating insects of the tropical forest were specialists. Each kind of plant had its own particular attackers, its own signature patterns of nibbled and mined and chewed leaves, a finely tuned web of who ate whom. After the impact, that web fell apart. The same generalized damage begins to show up on almost every kind of leaf, as though a simpler, hungrier, far less choosy set of insects had spread out across the whole forest. The intricate old partnerships were broken, and what grew back in their place was cruder and would take a long time to grow specialized again. So why did the open forest close? The team that read the record offered several possibilities, and the most arresting of them has to do with the dinosaurs themselves. A great many of them were enormous plant eaters, animals the size of trucks and small houses, moving through the forest in herds, tearing down branches, flattening saplings, opening clearings simply by being there. Very large plant eaters reshape the land around them. A modern elephant does the same work on a smaller scale, keeping woodland open and holding back the scrub. For 150 million years, the giant dinosaurs had been the gardeners of the world's forests, pruning them from below, holding them open, keeping the light coming down. And then, in a single season, every one of those gardeners was gone. With nothing left to knock the young trees back, the forest could finally do what a forest, left to itself, always tends to do. It grew up, and it grew close, and it shut out the sky. There were probably other forces working alongside that one. The impact spread ash and dust across the whole world, and ash can enrich a soil, and a rich soil tends to favor the fast, hungry, quick-growing flowering plants over the slower, more patient conifers. The dying, too, may not have fallen evenly. The conifers seem to have been hit harder than the flowering plants, which left open ground for them to pour into. None of these explanations cancels the others. Most likely they all worked together. The gardeners gone, the soil freshened, the old conifers thinned, every one of them tilting the tropics, decisively and for good, toward the flowering plants. The depth of that change is easy to miss. The asteroid did not only decide which creatures would live and which would die. It reached down and altered the very structure of the living world, the architecture of the forest itself, the rules by which plants competed and animals fed. A whole way of being a forest ended. A different way of being a forest took its place, and it has held for 66 million years. When we walk into a rainforest today and feel that particular closed, green cathedral hush, we are stepping into a shape that was set on the day the dinosaurs died. And this is the marvel to carry out of all of it. The single most alive place on Earth, the tropical rainforest, richer in kinds of living thing than anywhere else, the Amazon above all. owes its very form to the deadest day the planet has ever known. The most life came out of the most death. That green roof, which shelters more species than any other habitat on Earth, was drawn shut by the same blow that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. One of the scientists who pieced the story together put it about as plainly as it can be put. A single accident, one morning 66 million years ago, gave us the rainforests we have now. But a forest is never only its trees. When the canopy of the Paleocene closed and thickened and rose into its layers, it did more than change the plants. It built a whole new house, 100 new floors and corners and hollows, and everything that could reach them moved in. Into that dense, dim, three-dimensional green world came climbers and gliders, and above all, flyers. The remade forest filled with wings. And that raises a question we have not yet touched. The great flying reptiles of the old world had vanished along with the dinosaurs, so the sky above the new forest belonged to something else entirely. Who exactly was flying through the Paleocene? The answer, it turns out, was almost everything. Nearly every kind of bird we know today in some early, rough-cut form. But the bird that has drawn the most attention over the years, the one argued over longest and hardest, did not fly at all. It stood on the ground, and it stood taller than a person. And the question that hung over it for a century and a half was not whether it was frightening. It was what exactly it was doing with that enormous head. Its name is Gastonis. Picture a bird 2 meters high, heavy-bodied and thick-legged, with a neck like a young tree. At the end of it sits a head straight out of a bad dream, a huge, deep, blunt beak, tall as a hatchet and far stronger, set into a skull the size of a horse's. In parts of the early Paleocene, it was the largest land animal there was, bigger than any of the mammals, standing head and shoulders above the little archaic beasts that scurried around its feet. For most of the time since it was discovered, everyone was quite sure they knew what a bird like that was for. A head like that, in a world that had not yet grown any large hunting mammals, could only mean one thing. This, everyone agreed, was the hunter at the top of the food chain. That is how it was drawn, over and over for generations. A towering, merciless predator thundering through the Paleocene undergrowth after its terrified prey, running down the small early mammals and the little dawn horses and cracking their bones for a meal. It even picked up a nickname that stuck, the terror bird. And for a very long time, nobody had much reason to doubt it. The name felt exactly right. And then, slowly, the evidence began to say otherwise. When scientists looked closely, the case against the terror bird only kept building. They measured the chemistry of the bird's own bones, the carbon locked inside them, which carries the signature of whatever an animal ate in life. It came back reading not like a meat-eater at all, but like the plant-eaters that shared its world. They rebuilt the muscles that had worked the great jaw and found them arranged like the jaws of birds that grind and crush plants, not like those of birds that tear flesh. And they looked hard at the beak and noticed the thing that should have been obvious all along. For all its size, it had no hook. Every bird that kills and eats other animals, every eagle, every hawk, every owl, carries a hooked tip on its beak for tearing. Gastonis had none. Its great beak was not a weapon at all, but a nutcracker. There was more. Fossil footprints left by big birds of its kind, found of all places in what is now Washington state, show blunt, rounded toenails pressed into old mud. They are the feet of something that walked and browsed, not the hooked talons of something that seized and killed. And inside at least one of these birds were gastroliths, smooth, swallowed stones held in the gut to grind up tough plant food, exactly as a modern chicken or ostrich does. Every line of evidence pointed the same way. The great terror bird of the Paleocene, the supposed monster at the top of the food chain, was a vegetarian. Let that resettle for a moment, because it changes the whole picture. Gastornis was not a killer stalking a fearful world. It was a huge, placid, heavy-footed grazer, a bird the weight of a small bear, using that tremendous beak to crack open the hard nuts and tough seeds and woody stems that nothing else could reach. For all its terrible look, the biggest and most frightening animal of its world was, all along, doing something nearer to what a giant tortoise does, or a cow. The monster was a gardener. Even now, the science is still shifting around it. The North American members of the group, long filed under the single name Gastornis, were split back off into a genus of their own only in the last few years. But the heart of the matter has held. These giants ate plants. There is a small, useful lesson buried in that reversal. We are quick when we meet an animal built on a frightening scale to assume the worst of it, to see a great beak and imagine it tearing, to see a giant and imagine a killer. The rock keeps patiently correcting us. Again and again across this epoch, the monster turns out to have been minding its own quiet business. And there is a second thing the nickname got wrong. There really were birds that earned the name terror bird, genuinely fearsome, flightless, hook-beaked hunters that ran their prey down on powerful legs. But they came later, and they came somewhere else. Mostly a South American story, and mostly a story of the tens of millions of years after the Paleocene had ended. So the giant of the Paleocene was mislabeled twice over. The real terror birds were not around yet, and the bird that got called one had never terrorized anything more dangerous than a stand of hard-shelled nuts. Gastornis makes a wonderful story, but it was only one strange note in something far larger. There was room for a bird that size, and for all the birds beside it, because the sky itself had been emptied. All through the age of dinosaurs, the air had belonged to the pterosaurs, the great leathery-winged flying reptiles, the largest of them the size of a small aircraft. They died at the boundary along with everything else large, and the birds, which had slipped through, inherited an open sky. What happened next was the same story we have already watched twice, on the ground with the mammals and in the canopy with the flowering plants, now playing out a third time overhead. The birds exploded into new forms. The birds we know today, the songbirds and the parrots, the owls and the hawks, the hummingbirds and the herons and the ducks, the more than 10,000 kinds alive now, nearly all belong to a single great branch of the family tree that fanned out with astonishing speed right around the death of the dinosaurs. Its deep root runs back into the Cretaceous. But the fan itself, the sudden burst of new kinds, the filling of the air with finches and eagles and everything between, is a Paleocene event packed into a few million years. By a few million years past the boundary, the early forms are already turning up in the rock. A small tree-dwelling bird here sits near the base of the mousebirds. An ancestral seabird turns up there. The first hints appear of the great branches that would become the owls and the parrots and the songbirds. The modern sky was being sketched in roughly and fast. How fast and how far this went is hard to believe until you look at a single example. Within about 5 million years of the asteroid, a sliver of time by the measures of this story, there were already penguins. In the cool seas around what is now New Zealand, a bird had appeared that you would know at a glance. Flightless, upright, its wings no longer built for the air but flattened into stiff flippers, diving after fish in the cold water. It has a name, Waimanu, and it is the oldest penguin anyone has found, and it is already, unmistakably, a penguin. In 5 million years, a branch of the newly exploding birds had given up the sky altogether, rebuilt its wings for the sea, and gone under the waves. And it had done all of it while the ash of the old world was, in geological terms, barely cold. So the Paleocene sky and the Paleocene shore were a workshop of birds. One lineage gave up flight and grew into a 2-meter nutcracker on legs. Another gave up flight and slipped into the sea. 1,000 more stayed aloft and split again into the parrots and the perching birds and everything that would ever sing from a branch. In just a few million years, the class of birds went from a scatter of survivors to the seedbed of the most varied group of backboned animals in the world today. Everything that calls outside your window at dawn traces back, in the end, to that scramble in the recovering Paleocene. Rise up on a pair of those new wings, then, and look down. Beneath you, the recovering world spreads out, green and steaming, the closed roof of the young rainforest, the slow rivers with their giants coiled in the shallows, the herds of strange, heavy mammals moving under the trees, the whole reassembled machinery of a living world. It is a great deal to take in from a bird's height, but if you could climb higher still, higher than any bird can fly, high enough to hold whole continents in a single view, you would notice something none of the creatures below could ever feel. The land itself was not holding still. The coastlines were creeping, the oceans widening and closing, the continents sliding slowly and silently across the face of the earth. The stage on which the whole recovery had been playing out was, very quietly, on the move. Find a piece of solid ground and stand on it for a moment. It is the very picture of stillness, the thing we mean when we call something solid or grounded or set in stone. Nothing feels more permanent than the ground beneath your feet, and nothing you will ever stand on is permanent at all. The ground is moving. It is moving right now, under everyone alive, carrying whole continents across the face of the planet at a pace too slow for any human sense to catch. A few centimeters a year, about the speed your fingernails grow. Stay still long enough, and the map itself would change around you. The map of the world is not a fixed thing, it is a single frame of a very slow film, and the film never stops. Pull far enough back from the Paleocene and you can watch the whole planet slowly rearrange itself. Oceans opening, dry land rising, joined continents pulling apart, distant ones closing toward a collision. None of the creatures living through it could feel any of this. A drifting continent gives no sign. But the arrangement of the land and the water is the deepest thing there is about a world. It decides where life can go and where it cannot, what the climate does, what is connected and what is cut off. And in the Paleocene, that arrangement was nothing like the one we know. Take the North Atlantic, the ocean that now separates Europe from North America. In the Paleocene, it barely existed. The two great land masses had been pressed together for ages. Now a rift was tearing slowly open between them, a wound in the crust from which molten rock welled up, prizing the continents apart and letting a narrow new sea flood in. That sea was the infant Atlantic, and it was widening at the speed of a growing fingernail, which sounds like nothing until you remember that it has not stopped since, and the ocean is now thousands of kilometers across. And yet, all through the Paleocene, the two continents were still joined. A bridge of dry land ran across the far north by way of Greenland, high enough above the rising water to keep a road open between the old world and the new. Plants and animals could still walk from one to the other, even as the ocean opened beneath them. At the far south of the world, the opposite was happening. Things that would one day be separate were still holding together. South America, Antarctica, and Australia, the last great pieces of an old southern supercontinent called Gondwana, had not yet come fully apart. The narrow seaways that now cut Antarctica off from its neighbours had not yet opened, and that closed arrangement had an enormous consequence. Because no seaway ran all the way around Antarctica, no cold current could wheel around it and wall it off from the warm rest of the world. It was still plugged into the global circulation, still bathed in warm water and mild air. And so, as strange as it is to say, Antarctica in the Paleocene wore forests. The land that is now buried under 2 miles of ice was green. The oceans, too, were arranged in ways that would look wrong to a modern eye. A great warm sea, the Tethys, ran most of the way around the world along the equator, a belt of tropical water with no continents to block it, so that warm currents could circle the globe and spill the heat of the equator toward the poles. It is a large part of why the whole planet ran so mild. Closer to home, the map of North America was healing a long wound of its own. For much of the age of dinosaurs, a great inland sea had split the continent down the middle, from the Arctic to the Gulf. Through the Paleocene, that sea was draining away, its last shallow arms retreating, until the 2 halves of North America joined once more into a single landmass. Everywhere you looked, seas were opening and closing, land was joining and parting. The world was busy reorganizing itself in almost complete silence. All this rearranging of land and sea was not just a backdrop to the life recovering on top of it. It shaped that life at every turn. Where continents stayed joined, their plants and animals could mingle and stay similar, which is why the forests and beasts of Paleocene North America look so much like those of Paleocene Europe. The two were still one connected world, sharing their creatures back and forth across the northern bridge. And where a piece of land broke away and struck out on its own, its life was cut off, left to change in isolation into something found nowhere else. The map decided who met whom and who never would. The most extraordinary journey on the whole Paleocene map belonged to a single piece of land travelling entirely alone. Long before, India had broken away from the southern supercontinent and set off northward by itself, across the wide tropical ocean, an island continent adrift, carrying its own strange cargo of plants and animals, with nothing but open water ahead of it and a whole ocean to cross. Alone at sea for all those ages, it was the ultimate island, an entire continent cut off from every other, its life evolving in a long solitude into forms that existed nowhere else on Earth. And it was moving faster than any large piece of the Earth's crust is known to have moved, before or since. Fast, though, is a strange word for it. India was crossing that ocean at 15 or 20 centimeters a year, about the rate your hair grows and no faster. That is the top speed. That is as quick as any large piece of the Earth's crust has ever been known to move. Picture it, a continent the size of a subcontinent, holding whole mountain ranges and river systems and forests full of life, sliding across the face of the planet at the pace of growing hair and never once stopping. Not for a bad year, not for 1,000 bad years, not for anything at all. Inch by inch, decade by decade, it closed the gap. And somewhere near the end of the Paleocene, or soon after, the leading edge of India began to press against the underside of Asia. It was the first touch of a slow-motion collision that would go on for tens of millions of years, one that would crumple the seam between them upward into the highest mountains on Earth. The Himalayas are that collision made solid, and they are rising still. India has never stopped pushing north, a hair's width closer to the pole with every passing season from that day to this one. The astonishing part is that all of this was being written down as it happened. Every shift of the map, every drowned coastline and rising seam was pressed into rock, and pressed into that same rock, layer by layer, were the fossils of the life that rode along on top of it. A leaf that fell in a warm northern forest, a bone left in a river's mud, a shell dropped on the floor of the opening Atlantic. Each one was locked into stone that was itself drifting slowly across the face of the world, carried thousands of kilometers from where it began and lifted, in time, back into the light. The whole vanished map of the Paleocene and all the life it held is still there, kept in the rock. It only ever needed someone to learn how to read it. In the year 1874, In the old university city of Strasbourg, a man sat at a desk with a fossil in his hands. He was in his 60s by then, near the end of a long working life, and he knew plants, living and dead, about as well as anyone on Earth. The fossil he was turning over was a leaf, not a leaf itself exactly, but its ghost. The flat, faint, perfect impression a leaf leaves behind when it settles into fine mud, and the mud slowly hardens to stone. Pressed into the rock in front of him was the outline of a leaf that had fallen from a tree tens of millions of years before there was any human being alive to see it fall. His name was Wilhelm Philippe Schimper, and he was a botanist first, a specialist in mosses of all things, one of the great experts of his age on the smallest and simplest of plants. But he had spent years reading the fossil floras of Europe, the pressed and petrified remains of forests that no longer existed, and he had noticed something in them. Among the fossil leaves recovered from the rocks of the Paris Basin, from a certain range of layers, there was a distinct and consistent character, a plant world that was not quite like the ones above it in the rock, and not quite like the ones below. It was its own thing, and it did not yet have a name, so he gave it one. In a great treatise on fossil plants, he took that slice of the record, that distinct earlier world of leaves, and named it the Paleocene. The word is a quiet one, and its meaning is quieter still. It means, more or less, the old part of the Eocene, the earlier stretch of what geologists were already calling the dawn of the recent world. Schimper was carving off the very beginning of that dawn and giving it a name of its own. He has been dead for well over a century now, but the name has held. 150 years on, every geologist on Earth still calls those 10 million years exactly what a Strasbourg botanist decided to call them, on the evidence of some fossil leaves. A single scholar, working with nothing but the pressed impressions of leaves, had reached into the deep past and inserted an entire epoch into the history of the planet. There is something quietly audacious in the act itself, in the sheer human nerve of it. Time does not come divided. The Earth's history is one unbroken flow, with no lines ruled across it, no chapter breaks, no labels. Every named age and epoch and period is a human invention, a boundary we have drawn across the current of deep time to make it something a mind can hold. Schimper drew one such line. He looked at 10 million years of the world, a stretch that had held the fern spike and the first great mammals and the giant snake and the birth of the rainforest, and he gathered all of it under a single word and handed it to us. You can hold a fossil leaf like the ones Schimper held. Museums and collectors have them by the drawful, and they are not, on the whole, expensive or rare. Pick one up and it sits in your palm as light as a coin, a slab of grey stone with the print of a leaf on its face, the outline sharp, the central rib clear, the fine net of the veins still faintly there. It is a real leaf. It grew on a real branch, in a real forest, and it fell on a real afternoon into the still water of some vanished pond, and now it is in your hand, and the forest it grew in has been gone for 60 million years. To hold it is to do, in miniature, the thing this whole science does. You are looking at a lost world through the one small piece of it that survived. Schimper's leaf stands for something larger than one man's naming. Think of everything we have walked through in this vanished world, and then remember that no one ever saw it. Not one mind witnessed it. There was no observer to understand it, no chronicler to set it down, nothing that kept a record on purpose. And yet we know it now, in a detail that would have seemed like pure fantasy in Schimper's own day. Every fact in this whole story was not remembered but recovered, read, decoded, and pieced back together out of things that were never meant to carry a message at all. Consider what the evidence actually is. A grain of pollen the size of a dust mote can name the plants that once covered a continent. From the worn ridges of a tooth, we recover an animal's diet. From the fine layers inside that same tooth, red like tree rings, the very days of its one short life. The chemistry of a fossil shell reports the temperature of a vanished sea. Magnetism frozen into cooling rock records which way the map was drifting. And the age of the whole catastrophe is counted, atom by atom, in the slow decay of crystals. Not one of these things was made to be read. A leaf does not fall in order to be understood. And yet, one patient clue at a time, we have taught ourselves to make all of them speak. It would be a mistake, though, to make all this sound too tidy or too finished. The reading is never done, and it is never quite certain. Every figure in this story carries a quiet fringe of doubt around it. How long did the ferns truly reign? 1,000 years? Or 10 times that? How hot were the tropics, really, once you stop trusting the snake? The picture is always being redrawn, sharpened here, corrected there, argued over in journals. What we have is not a photograph of the Paleocene, but a careful, provisional sketch, the best reading of a silent text that a few generations of patient people have managed so far. It is astonishing how much of it we can make out, and sobering how much is still a guess. And there is a deep and quiet wonder in that. The Paleocene left the world no message. It simply was, for 10 million years, and then it ended, indifferent to whether it would ever be known. And out of that indifference, out of dumb stone and pressed leaves and worn-down teeth, a species that arrived long afterward has recovered the shape of the whole thing, its warmth, its forests, its animals, the very drift of its continents. A person can now stand in a quiet museum, turn a fossil leaf in the light, and read a lost world in it, as surely as Shimper did. The silence has been made to speak. That may be the most remarkable thing in this entire story, not the world that was lost, but the fact that so much of it has been found again. And yet, for all that reading, for all that patient recovery, there is one question the stones have never quite been willing to answer. Shimper could name an epoch from a handful of leaves. We can take the temperature of a 60-million-year-old sea, but when we turn the same tools on the one question we most want answered, when exactly did our own kind of life begin? The rock grows strangely quiet, and the answers stop agreeing with one another. The leaves and the bones say one thing. The molecules in our own living cells say another. And the gap between them is the last great argument of this epoch, the place where, even now, the record will not quite give up its secret. There is a strange asymmetry in what we know about this epoch. We can date its opening, the death of the old world, the day the asteroid fell, with a precision that borders on the absurd. 66 million years ago, give or take about 11,000. We know when the dinosaurs died more exactly, in relative terms, than we know the dates of some things that happened to our own ancestors only a few thousand years ago. But ask a different question. Not when the old world ended, but when our own began, and all that precision falls away. When did the modern branches of mammal life first split apart? When did the line that leads to us, to the primates, and to every warm creature you would recognize, actually come into being? On that question, the one we might care about most, the honest answer is that we do not know, and that the best estimates disagree with one another by tens of millions of years. We can date the death of the dinosaurs to within about 11,000 years, a hairline crack set against the depth of the age. The birth of our own kind of life we cannot date to within tens of millions. The trouble is that we have two witnesses to the birth, and they tell different stories. One witness is the stone, the fossils themselves, the bones and teeth pressed into the rock, and the stones are fairly clear about it. Those fossils, the first true primates, the first carnivores, the first of the hoofed animals we would know, do not show up until after the boundary, in the Paleocene and the epoch beyond. Read the rock at face value, and the answer is plain. Our world began after the old one ended. Our modern branches appeared in the emptied aftermath, and not before. The second witness is stranger, and it lives inside the animals themselves. Every living thing carries, in its DNA, a slow-ticking record of its own past. Mutations build up in the genes at a roughly steady rate, generation after generation, so that the more different the DNA of two creatures, the longer ago their lineages must have parted. Count those differences carefully, calibrate the rate, and you have a clock, a molecular clock, that can estimate how long ago any two branches of life split apart without a single fossil to go on. Turn that clock on the modern mammals, and it tells a different story from the stones. It says the branches were already dividing well before the asteroid, back in the Cretaceous, while the dinosaurs still ruled the world. On this reading, our line is older than any fossil of it, a quiet presence in the undergrowth of the old world, waiting. Take our own earliest trace. The oldest fossil we have of the primate line is that little tree climber from the recovering forests, dated to 100-odd thousand years after the impact. It is a real anchor, a fixed point in the record. But it anchors only a minimum. It tells us the line was at least that old, not that it began then. That animal had parents and grandparents, and a long line of forebears stretching back who knows how far into a past that left nothing behind at all. The clock says that line reaches back across the boundary and into the Cretaceous, but the oldest bone we have can neither confirm that nor rule it out. So which witness do we believe? The honest answer is that both are telling the truth, both are limited, and neither can quite be trusted on its own. Fossils give only a minimum age. A fossil tells you a lineage was at least this old. But the first members of any group are few and small and easily missed. They may have lived for ages before one of them happened to fall into the right mud and turn to rock. In truth, the fossil record almost always starts late. The clock, for its part, has its own troubles. Mutations do not tick quite as evenly as the method needs them to, and calibrating the rate is a delicate, arguable business, so the clock can be made to run a little fast or a little slow, depending on how it is set. Ask the stones, and you get one answer. Ask the clocks, and you get another, and there is no simple way to make them agree. For a long time, this was a real fight, and a bitter one. On one side stood the readers of the stone, who took the fossil record at its word. The modern orders did not exist before the boundary, but burst into being in the empty world afterward. An explosion of new forms in a geological instant. On the other stood the readers of the clock, who trusted the DNA. The orders were already there in the Cretaceous, running along a long hidden fuse, and only stepped into the light and diversified once the dinosaurs were gone. It came down to a stark choice: explosion or slow fuse, a sudden birth in the aftermath, or a long, quiet gestation in the world before. The two sides argued it out for decades, each with its mountain of evidence, and for a long time neither would give. In the last few years, though, the two sides have begun to meet in the middle, and the truce that is emerging is more interesting than either extreme. It runs something like this: our line probably did exist before the asteroid, just as the clocks insist, but only barely, and only as a few thin, obscure threads, a handful of unremarkable lineages hiding in the shadow of the dinosaurs and leaving almost no trace at all. But the great flowering, the real explosion into the modern orders, the primates and the carnivores and the hoofed multitudes, came afterward in the emptied Paleocene, exactly where the stones had always put it. The lineage is older than its fossils. The living world it built is younger. Both witnesses, it turns out, had been half right all along. The birds, as it happens, tell the same story in the same shape, a deep root reaching back into the Cretaceous, and the great fan of modern kinds opening only after the boundary. But do not mistake this new middle ground for a settled peace. Just how far back those first splits reach, how deep into the old world our earliest threads go is still genuinely open, still argued over by tens of millions of years. The broad shape of the tree of our origins is drawn now with some confidence, but down at the very root, where our branch first pulls away from all the rest, the lines go faint and uncertain, and the honest map makers leave them dotted. So let us put the question plainly. Is it fair to say that we know where we came from? In one sense, yes, we can follow our own ancestry back through the ages with real confidence, through the apes and the early primates and the small climbers in the Paleocene trees, deep into this recovering world. But at the very beginning of it, at the morning our kind of life first drew apart from everything else, we run out of certainty. The record blurs, the witnesses fall out, and the truest thing we can say is, we are not yet sure. There is a temptation to find that frustrating, even a little embarrassing, a gap that ought, by rights, to be filled, but it can be held another way. There is a quiet, unembarrassed dignity in being able to point at the origin of your own kind and say honestly that the answer is not yet in, and to sit with that comfortably, in no hurry at all. Some of the best knowledge a mind can hold is the clean, calm knowledge of exactly what it does not know. So we will leave that question where it honestly sits, open, unhurried, its edges soft. It is not a wound in the story, it is only the far, dim beginning of a line that runs, unbroken, all the way to you. And there is no need to press on it tonight. For most of the Paleocene, in any case, that question of origins had already been answered by simply happening. The threads had split whenever they split. The orders were fanning out. The world was full and warm and busy. What the epoch mostly did, across the long stretch of its middle, was neither begin nor end. Instead, it simply ran, million after million of quiet, forgotten, unremarkable years, in which the great recovery settled into an ordinary world just getting on with the business of being alive. And it is into that long, warm, unhurried middle that we can let ourselves drift now. Set the arguments aside now, and the discoveries, and the giants, and the debates, and just imagine living through the middle of it. Not the drama at either end, not the fire that opened the epoch, and not the heat that will close it, but the long, ordinary stretch in between. The great recovery was over and done, and the world had simply become a place again. Millions of years of it. Warm mornings, one after another, over green and unhurried forests. Nothing to survive, nothing to invent, and nothing, in the way we usually mean it, happening at all. It is hard for us to sit still inside a stretch of time like that. We are built for events, for beginnings and endings, crises and triumphs, the moments when things change. But the truth of the Paleocene, and of most of deep time, is that the dramatic moments are the rare exceptions, not the rule. What there is, overwhelmingly, is the in-between, the long, uneventful, patient continuance of a world that is simply carrying on. If you could stand in the middle of the epoch and watch it pass, you would wait a very long time for anything you would call news. The forests would green and drop their leaves and green again. Generations of small, warm animals would come and go in the undergrowth. Rivers would find new courses, then slowly abandon them. And the sun would rise on all of it, day after day after day, warm and indifferent, for longer than you could stand to watch. Let one such afternoon stand for all the others. Somewhere in the warm heart of the epoch 60 million years ago, in a forest with no name and no record, the light comes down green through a high canopy onto a floor of ferns and fallen leaves. A small mammal, one of the countless anonymous kinds, noses through the litter after seeds and insects, its heart beating fast, its whole brief life ahead of it and behind it in equal measure. Rain moves through in the afternoon and passes. A bird calls somewhere and goes quiet. Nothing about the day is remarkable, and nothing about it will ever be remembered. And it is exactly like 10,000 other days, each one full, each one complete, each one gone. And there were so many of them. The quiet middle of the epoch ran for something like 5 million years, half the length of the whole Paleocene, and on its own, roughly twice the span of the entire human genus. Set every warm, unremarkable day of it end to end, and the number climbs past anything a mind can picture. Billions of dawns, uncounted generations living and dying in the undergrowth. Whole forests rising and falling and rising again. All of it flowed past with no one to mark it. No calendar, no clock, but the slow drift of the continents and the even slower turning of the stars. It is, in the end, most of what deep time actually is. Not the events, but the immense, patient, unwatched duration in between them. And the record keeps almost none of it. This is the honest, humbling truth about the deep middle of the Paleocene. For long stretches of it, we have barely anything at all. There are gaps in the rock, hundreds of thousands of years in places, sometimes more, where the pages are as good as blank, where almost nothing was preserved and almost nothing can be read. We know those spans happened. We can see the world on one side of a gap and the world on the other subtly changed, and we can be sure that all the missing time flowed between them, day by day, as full and alive as any other. But the time itself is gone from the record. It passed unwitnessed and unrecorded, and the only trace it left is the quiet fact that things are a little different afterward. It is tempting, faced with all that emptiness, to write the whole middle off, to call it, as people often have, a boring gap. A dull stretch of filler between two more interesting things, the dinosaurs' death behind it, the warm Eocene ahead. And it is true that the middle Paleocene holds no single moment as sharp as the fire or the heat that bracket it. But to call it boring is to make a deep mistake about what the quiet actually is. The blank in the record is not a blank in the world. The world was not empty then. It was full, as full of leaves and animals and weather and life as it ever is. And the reason so little of it comes down to us is not that little was happening, but that a calm, well-fed world simply leaves fewer marks than a dying one. Catastrophes announce themselves in the rock. Ordinary happiness does not. And the world was not standing still either, not truly. It only looks still because it changed so slowly. Watch the middle of the epoch at its own pace, and you would see nothing move. Watch it sped up, though, compress those millions of years into an hour, and you would see a slow, ceaseless flow. One community of animals shading imperceptibly into the next, each generation almost identical to the one before it, and slightly, invisibly different, until across enough time the whole cast had quietly turned over. The forests drifting slowly in their makeup, the climate creeping upward, a fraction of a degree at a time. Nothing you could ever point to as an event, and yet everything, in the end, in motion. A world remaking itself so gradually that no creature living in it could ever have known. There is a rightness to this, if you have followed the whole arc of the epoch. We opened it in fire and silence, in a world stripped down to almost nothing. We watched it fight its way back. The ferns, the forests, the small survivors becoming everything, the giants and the strange birds and the great snake, the whole slow reconstruction of a living world. And this long, warm, uneventful middle is what all that recovery was for. This is the world the survivors were climbing toward, not another catastrophe, not another revolution, but exactly this, an ordinary, unremarkable, fully living planet, at rest in its own warmth. There is a particular kind of peace in a stretch of time like that. The middle of the Paleocene asks nothing of anyone. It is a world with no crisis in it, no one keeping score, no witness at all, just warmth and green, and the slow turning of the generations, going on and on with no aim beyond continuing. We tend to think a world needs drama to be worth our attention. This one suggests otherwise. For millions of years, the finest thing the planet did was simply to keep a warm, full, uneventful world running, quietly, in no hurry, with nothing to prove and no one to prove it to. That is not a boring achievement. It may be the rarest and most precious thing there is, a living world, at ease, simply being alive. And yet, for all its calm, the long middle was not without a destination. Under the warm, unremarkable surface of those millions of years, something was very slowly building. The world was growing warmer, not sharply, not alarmingly, just a patient rise in the heat, a fraction of a degree and then another, spread across the last long stretch of the epoch, far too gradual for anything alive to feel. It was the faint, rising note beneath the quiet. For the peace of the long, warm middle did not, in the end, simply fade away. Near the very close of the epoch, at what we might call its far door, that slow gathering warmth broke, all at once, into the greatest heat the Paleocene world would ever know. After 10 million years of quiet, the whole story comes down, at the last, to a single burning moment. And the quiet is about to break. After 10 million years, the ending came fast. In the space of a few thousand years, a single held breath, against the depth of the epoch, the whole planet warmed by 5, 6, as much as 8 degrees. Not one region, not one season, the entire Earth, top to bottom and pole to pole, several degrees hotter than it had ever been. This is one of the most abrupt warmings in the whole history of the planet. The event has a name, a mouthful of one, but what matters is what it did. It closed the Paleocene. It is the far door of this story, and the world went out through it into a fever. What did it was carbon. An enormous quantity of it, thousands of billions of tons, was loosed into the air and the sea in a geological hurry, and the greenhouse it made drove the temperature up. Where all that carbon came from is still argued over. The best current guess points at volcanoes. The same tearing open of the North Atlantic that was splitting Europe from North America seems to have belched huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the deep earth right at the end of the epoch. Some of it may have come from the seafloor itself, from frozen stores of methane that thawed and bubbled up as the world warmed. Whatever the mix, the result was the same. A surge of heat-trapping gas laid over a world already among the warmest the planet has known. And it left its mark everywhere, a single sharp signature written into the chemistry of rock on every continent and every ocean floor, the fingerprint of the day the carbon came. The heat did what heat does, only at the scale of a world. The tropics, already sweltering, grew hostile to a lot of life. High latitudes turned mild and green where they had merely been cool. And the oceans, drinking down so much of the carbon, turned slowly sour, more acidic than they had been, until the tiny shelled creatures that carpet the deep sea floor began, in places, to dissolve. Down in the dark of the ocean bottom there was an extinction, small beside the one that had opened the epoch, but real, a quiet dying, 10 million years after the loud one. On land, stranger things happened. Some kinds of mammal, over the generations of the hottest stretch, actually shrank, grew smaller in the heat, as though the world were dialing them down, and then grew back when it passed. For something like 150,000 years, the fever held. Then, slowly, the Earth pulled the carbon back out of the air and the water, the temperature eased, and the worst of it was over. You can almost see it if you let yourself. A world already hot, tipping over into something hotter. The equatorial forests steaming under a haze, the rivers running low and warm, the shallow seas gone the temperature of a bath and strangely quiet where the small-shelled things had thinned. And up at the poles, where the ice of our own world sits, There was instead a wet green warmth, palms and broad leaves and slow brown water spreading a little further north with every passing century. There was nothing violent about it to look at, just a soft, heavy, overheated world, a hothouse cranked a few degrees past even its own long summer. Live inside it, and you would feel almost nothing. That is the strange thing about a warming like this. Even at its fastest, it unfolded across thousands of years, which means that in any single human span, in a life or in 100 lives, the change would have been all but invisible. A person born into the warming would have felt the summers much as their grandparents felt them. The tide of heat rose too slowly for any creature to notice it rising, and yet it rose without pause, decade after decade, century after century, creeping up through the forests and out across the seas and over the tops of the continents until the whole world had quietly crossed into a hotter age. It was a fever that took 10,000 human lifetimes to run its course. And every one of those lifetimes felt like ordinary weather. But the heat did something else, far up at the top of the world, that would matter more than any of it. The warming pushed the mild zone poleward, and the far north, never frozen in this epoch but cool, grew warm enough to carry unbroken forest clear across it. The Arctic became a green road, and where there is a warm road, life travels. Across the top of the world, over the land bridges that still joined the continents, a wave of new animals came travelling in the heat of that closing fever. They spread almost at once into Asia and Europe and North America, turning up in the rock of all three at very nearly the same moment, as though a door had opened everywhere at once. And of all the animals that walked that warm road, one group matters to us more than the rest. Among them were the first true primates, not the small archaic climbers of the early Paleocene, but the real thing, the founders of the line that runs to the lemurs and the monkeys and the apes, and onward to us. They appear at the fever, and they spread on the fever, carried across the warming north into 3 continents at once. Think about that for a moment. The great heat that ended the Paleocene, that soured the seas, shrank the mammals, and closed the epoch. That same heat threw open the top of the world and let our own ancestors walk through, out of the old epoch and into the new. The door out of the Paleocene was a heat wave, and our own kind is on the far side of it because of the warmth, not in spite of it. There is one more thing to say about that fever, and it has to weigh a little heavier than the rest, because it is the closest thing in the whole long record of the Earth to what our own time is doing. A great slug of carbon loosed into the air and the sea, warming the world and souring the oceans. We have set exactly that in motion. It is the best natural experiment we have for where all this leads. But there is one difference, and it is the difference that matters most. That fever was slow. Its carbon came out over thousands of years. Ours is coming out over 100 or 2, which is to say that we are running the same experiment on the same planet, perhaps 5 or 10 times faster than the Earth has ever run it on its own. The comfort, and it is a real one, is that the planet did this before and healed. The humbling part is that it has never had to heal so quickly. And that is as far as this quiet story will follow the thought tonight. Because whatever we have set going, the Earth's patience is older and deeper than our hurry, and it was patience in the end that carried the Paleocene through. And carry it through it did. The fever broke. Over the long, slow tail of it, the Earth drew the carbon back down out of the air and the sea. The temperature came off its peak, the acid drained out of the oceans, and the world steadied. It did not steady back into the Paleocene, though. That epoch was finished. What lay on the far side of the heat was a new age, the Eocene, hotter still than the Paleocene had been, greener, stranger, and full of the modern animals that had come north on the warmth. The far door had swung shut behind the world we have been walking through. 10 million years of a planet putting itself back together had ended, as, in the end, they were always going to end, not in another catastrophe from the sky, but in a long, warm exhalation of the Earth's own breath. So the epoch that opened in a fire from the sky closed in a heat from within. The two great breaths of the Earth, one in and one out, and 10 million years of a healing world held between them. And this is the quiet, astonishing end of it. That closing warmth, the fever that shut the Paleocene, is the same warmth that opened the road our own ancestors travelled. We are here, tonight, on the far side of that door, because a world once ended gently in the heat and let the small primates through. Everything since, every epoch after, every ice age, every human life, every one of us listening now in the dark, is what came out the other side. The Paleocene is over. It has been over for 56 million years, and yet its far door opens, in a sense, right here, onto us, its distant and unlikely inheritors, still carrying the warmth of that last morning somewhere in the blood. Let us stand, one last time, on a warm shore near the end of it. The sea is quiet and the colour of weak tea, warm to the ankles, with no cold current anywhere in the world to trouble it. Behind us, the forest runs unbroken to a green and unfrozen pole. Somewhere in the branches, a small warm animal is doing what small warm animals have always done, untroubled by the heat that is slowly rising, unaware that the epoch it was born into is drawing to a close. It is an ordinary morning. There have been 10 million years of ordinary mornings, and this is one of the last. Now let the view begin to pull back. Lift up off that shore the way we once lifted off on a bird's wing, and watch the whole warm world fall away beneath you. The steaming forests, the drifting continents, the giant snake in its river, the great gentle birds, the herds of animals with no names left to them. Keep rising. Watch the 10 million years fold together into a single band of pale rock, thinner than your hand, pressed between two darker lines. The fire that opened the epoch and the heat that closed it. And keep rising still until even that band is only one stripe among thousands, one green breath in the almost endless breathing of the earth. Think back over the whole of it now, from up here where the epoch is only a stripe of rock. It began in fire and silence, in a world scoured down to almost nothing, a thin grey line of ash you could cover with one hand, and above it, ferns from horizon to horizon, and a quiet the earth had not known in 100 million years. And out of that emptiness, patiently, with no plan and no hurry, a world rebuilt itself. The forests came back and grew tall and strange and closed their canopies into the first rainforests. Small survivors crept up out of their burrows and became everything. The archaic beasts we have forgotten, the first great grazers, the giant birds, and in the trees, the little climbers who were the beginning of us. The map slid and reshaped beneath all of it, and the heat rose at the poles until the ice was gone and forests stood at the top of the world. And in a hot river near the equator, a snake grew to a size the world has never matched again. All of it, the whole crowded pageant, fits inside that one pale band of stone. And here is the reckoning we owe this vanished world before we let it go. We know a great deal about it now, more than anyone might have believed possible, more than its own inhabitants could ever have known. Its temperature we have read in the bones of a snake and the edges of its leaves. The days of a single animal's life we have counted in the layers of one tooth. We have watched a broken world haul itself back to fullness, frame by frame, and traced our own small ancestors climbing toward the light in its recovering trees. And a man in a quiet European city gave the whole thing a name, on the evidence of a handful of pressed leaves. It is an extraordinary act of recovery, and we should not be shy about how much of it we have got right. And still, This is the honest part. Most of the Paleocene is gone, and gone for good. For every fact we have wrung from the rock, there are 10,000 that will never be recovered. Whole stretches of those 10 million years left no record at all, and passed unwitnessed and unremembered, as full and alive as any other, and utterly beyond our reach. We do not know, and may never know for certain, the morning our own kind of life truly began. The clocks and the stones still disagree, and perhaps they always will. What we have is a sketch, a careful, honest, incomplete sketch of a world that was once as real and as crowded and as ordinary as this one. The rest has been let go. Somewhere in that letting go are creatures we met only in passing and will never meet again. The strange, archaic beasts that ruled the recovery and left no descendants. The grazers and the diggers and the little tree cousins of our own line, whole dynasties that flourished for millions of years and vanished without leaving so much as a name in any language. They were the whole of the living world once, as certain of their permanence as we are of ours. And they are gone now, past all recovering, folded into the same rock, keeping the same silence. We can lift a bone of one of them into the light and wonder at it. But we cannot bring the animal back, or the afternoon it lived in, or the world it thought would last forever. There is a particular grief in that, if you let yourself feel it. Not a sharp grief, but a soft and distant one. Every one of those unwitnessed mornings was a whole world. The light came down through the leaves, the water ran. Some small heart beat fast in the undergrowth, wanting to live exactly as every small heart does. And all of it happened in full and mattered to whatever was living it, and then was gone, unnamed, unrecorded, unmourned, folded down into rock and forgotten by everything but the rock itself. 10 million years of that, billions of mornings, each one complete, each one lost. And yet a little of it did survive, and that little is precious beyond measure. A leaf pressed into stone, a tooth, a single vertebra too large to believe, a grain of pollen the size of a speck of dust. Out of scraps like these, the tiniest fraction of everything that was, we have called a whole lost world back into the light, and can hold it now in the mind and turn it over and wonder at it. That we can do this at all is one of the strangest and finest things our kind has ever managed. The Earth kept no memory of the Paleocene, and so we made one for it. It is very hard for us to feel a number like 4.5 billion years, so do not try to feel the number. Feel instead the patience of it. A world where a continent takes 20 million years to cross an ocean, where a mountain range rises over a span that would swallow the whole of human history 1,000 times, where the ordinary unit of change is not the day or the year, but the age. Millions of years at a stroke. That is the tempo the Earth actually keeps. Everything we call history, everything our species has ever done, from the first fire to this very moment, fits into the thinnest sliver at the top of the last page. The Paleocene, 10 million years long, is 30 times that whole human sliver, and it is still only one breath. Before it, there were other worlds, hundreds of them, each as full and as real as the one we have been walking. The age of dinosaurs, and stranger ages before that, forests and seas and creatures that would make the Paleocene look like home. Each of them rose and flourished and was lost. And after the Paleocene came more. The hot Eocene, the long cooling that followed, the coming of the ice, the slow descent into the world we were born into. World after world after world, most of them with no witness at all, rising and passing while the sun crossed a sky that did not change and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. This is what the Earth does. It builds a world and holds it for a while, a few million years, a few tens of millions, and then lets that world go and builds another. There is no cruelty in this. There is no anything in it The planet simply keeps making worlds and letting them fall, patiently, endlessly, the way the tide keeps coming in and going out, the way a breath keeps going in and coming out, for 4.5 billion years, and counting. The Paleocene was one of those worlds. It rose out of a catastrophe, greened itself over, filled with life, and was closed by a warm wind at its far door. And the Earth, which had made 1,000 such worlds before it, and would make more after, barely broke stride. So what do we hold when we sit with all of this in the quiet? A few small things perhaps, that we are made of the survivors, that every one of us is the far end of an unbroken line of small, warm, frightened creatures who came through the worst day the world has ever had and kept going, generation after generation, through fire and ice and the long, warm middle, all the way to this room tonight. We are not separate from that lost world. We are what it became, and this too, that the forgetting is not a cruelty. It only looks like one from close up, from inside a single short life that wants to matter and to last. Step back far enough, and the letting go is simply what time is, the price and the grace of a world large enough to keep making new things. Nothing is kept forever. Everything is kept for a while. The Paleocene was kept for 10 million years, and that was enough, and then it was let go, and that was right. And so, in the end, the great age of the Earth is not a weight pressing down on us. It is the opposite. To feel how old the world is, how brief we are, how much has risen and been lost before us, and will rise and be lost long after. This does not make us small in the way we fear. It makes us light. The day's worries settle into their true and tiny proportion, and it gives us, if we will let it, somewhere enormous and quiet to lay our heads. So set it all down. There is nothing tonight that the Paleocene has not already outlasted 1,000 times over. Whatever is pressing on you, the thing left undone, the word unsaid, the worry turning over and over in the dark, set it, just for now, against 10 million years of warm mornings that came and went and troubled no one. Your worry is real. It is also very small and very brief, and held inside something almost unimaginably patient and enormous. That is not a sad thought. Tonight, let it be a soft one. The world we have been walking through is gone. It went gently in the end, not in fire, but in a slow, warm breath, letting our own ancestors out through its far door and into the long making of us. It asks nothing of you now. What it offers is only what it always offered. A warm, unhurried world, in no hurry at all, where the light comes down green and the water runs slow, and there is nothing whatsoever to be done. So let the day go. Let the long stretch of years open beneath you. The 10 million of the Paleocene, the 56 million since, the 4.5 billion before. And feel how much room there is in it, how much quiet, how much time. There is time enough. There has always been time enough. The Earth has been holding you the whole while, and it is holding you now. You do not have to hold any of it up. Not the day, not the years, not the great weight of all that time. It holds itself. It has held itself for 4.5 billion years, and it will go on long after this small night is over. So let your grip loosen. Let the whole slow, patient, enormous thing carry you, the way it has carried everything, the ferns and the survivors and the giants and the small climbers who became us, down the long green corridor of deep time toward morning. There is nothing to keep. There is nothing to hold. There is only the warm dark and the deep time beneath it, wide enough at last to sleep in. Rest now. The old world has you. Sleep well. Let the forests green and drop their leaves and green again.